Yes, I am.
Maya, nice to meet you. Thank you for coming.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Nice to have you here. It's very weird.
I was chairman of the board for the Euphrates Institute.
Yeah, it's a good space.
So what's on the agenda tonight?
I think the connects the club, the LGBT student and ally clubs. I think they're going to do
What's it called?
Connect. Yeah, but it's a little circle with the. So I think they're going to do a sort of overview of what we understand of history. You know, like and then I think we're going to switch with the panelists who come with alumni and do the Q&A. And then there's wonderful statements, they collect statements from alumni. There's stuff there's wonderful
That's just next door.
yeah, under all of their so I think they're going to do sort of two panels, an alumni, and then there's an event afterwards, which is very based on queer eye, so it's like a makeover.
Here or?
Over in the dining hall.
Oh, okay.
So it's set up to go.
Okay. And I just wanted to express my appreciation for you.
She hasn't asked yet. And the bottom line is we don't have it. And I think like all things bureaucratic, it's trying to figure out what it looks like to give somebody. Anyway, so I just posted that query presentation. I don't know what it will look like being straight to the honorary. Because, you know, that is something that we negotiated with the registrar. And I said, I think so, and I've said we will continue.
Yeah. Has there been any efforts to give the precedent
I'm sure yeah. No, I think that's a great idea. I mean, I've done things like probably what is you know, I like someone said I want to come back
to Substantive. Just thinking out loud.
No, you're right. The fact that the way that you're I agree with you. Say, what is it like? So there's some examples of things that you do, I think, right? Like delete or
Hello, and welcome to the 5-year anniversary commemoration of the policy change. On November 18th, 2014, the policy that discriminated against homosexuals attending Principia or working at Principia was overturned, and in favor of a more inclusive modern policy. And we are here today to celebrate and honor all the important events and steps along the way and voices along the way that led towards this change. If you don't know me, I'm Samantha Frank. I'm Connect's event director.
I'm Chris Strong, and I'm a Connect board member.
I'm Dana Cady. I'm the Connect president.
I'm Emma Lopez. I'm also a Connect board member.
I'm Layla Ghanem, and I'm also a Connect board member.
Okay, so we're just wanting to start out with a little brief disclaimer that this history is very dynamic, multi-generational. It crosses 2 campuses. It's at all levels: student, staff, faculty, alumni. There are so many people in so many pieces of this that there's going to be a lot of information that we will never know, and then some information that we just don't currently know. So what we're sharing with you tonight is what we do know and have gathered, and just to know that all of the voices, all of the actions that have culminated in this are being felt tonight, and in being felt in Prin's progress, whether or not it's explicitly mentioned. So, yes. And I'll turn it over to Chris to start.
So for the purposes of the timeline, we separated into 6 eras. The first era, which is the one that I focused on, is called the silenced era. If we could switch over. Could you do a present for me? Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you. So we call this the silenced era, not because there wasn't any LGBT plus advocacy during the time. There certainly was that, and you'll hear these amazing stories of courage later in the night. It was just because every time there was even a little bit of advocacy, any bit of word, it was shut down immediately by the Principia administration. So because of this, Principia LGBT students of the time were forced to be silent, were forced to be closeted. Yep. So for each era, we're going to show the policy status of the time. And it's kind of interesting, actually. There wasn't an explicit policy against homosexuality until the year 2000 in the student handbook. And the reason for this is they just must have thought, like, our students are way too pure to ever go into anything like that. So, but that was not the case. So just keep going, moving on. Okay, so we're going to start off by hearing a quote from an LGBT student that went to Prin in the late 70s and early 80s.
My experience was that there wasn't an LGBT plus community. There was no dialogue that queerness exists, except a fundamental error in thought. My knowing that that was the culture climate back then and wanting to fit in kept me closeted, even to myself. I never knew self-identified LGBT persons at Principia except the young woman I got involved with and kicked out with.
It's safe to say that there were hundreds of stories like this prior to groups popping up in the 80s and 90s and up until the policy change, where the feeling of isolation, because everyone had to stay closeted, everyone had to stay silent, and that feeling of isolation can make you feel like you're the only person that feels this way, and when that just simply wasn't the case. We heard many stories of, as well, some gay and lesbian students turning to Christian Science and going to practitioners in order to heal their supposed illness. So, in my opinion, you can't tackle the LGBT issues of Principia until you tackle the issues of the CS movement entirely. And one of the first groups to do this was Emergence International, and they began meeting in the late 70s around the country and in the United Kingdom. Their first meeting was held, or their first conference was held in Chicago in 1893, and they became a group in 1896. So they were very much pioneers in the CS movement before anyone thought about challenging the policies at Prin. So one of the first groups to actually show up at Principia was called Gay and Lesbian Principians. It was organized by alumnus Chandler Burr, and their first project was to identify as many gay and lesbian students as possible, which was the first list ever made. And they actually held the first dialogue with college administration, and they could do that because they had already graduated. And another group that popped up 3 years later, led by ally David Storrs, is Students Opposed to Bigotry and Discrimination. So David Storrs was an ally, and the main thing that Stop Bad did, they had straight students at the time because the LGBT students at Prin couldn't really speak for themselves. They had straight students gain the trust of pretty much of the gay and lesbian students to voice issues of the time. And one of the things that they did was hold a survey in, this is actually 1996, and the question was, should you allow gay students if they, on campus, if they follow the Principia policy, which is no sex prior to marriage? And actually 200 students answered, and 70% were in favor of openly gay students on campus. So this shows 18 years before the policy actually changed, how most of the people on campus, most students already had progressive views, and that seems to be the case early on. It's just the administration and the donors that really wouldn't budge. Okay, so now we're going to move on to a quote from a faculty member in 1999 to kind of show the hiring process of the time.
When I came to Prin to interview for my current position, I was told by a department chair that at the time, all prospective hires were given a meeting with the chief executive, who would ask, among other things, if you were prepared to support the homosexuality policy that was in place then. When I finally got into the meeting with the CE, he described the anti-homosexuality policy and simply said, "Do you understand this?" I said, "Yes," and that was it. I had braced myself for a situation where I'd either have to lie to get the job or I'd have to be truthful and likely not get the job, but I dodged the whole thing because of the way he phrased the question.
And around this time, Principia College faculty began to leave or forced to leave over the discriminatory policy. So now we're going to move to the resistance era with Samantha.
Okay, so faculty Dr. Billy Miller articulates well the expectations of the administration from the silenced era through the resistance, which Dana is going to read.
Yes. Over time, and without rhyme or legitimate reason, I learned that this homophobic culture included written and unwritten rules to which I was to adhere. Always report anyone who I believed to be homosexual to the administration. Never convene any group meeting to discuss ideas of homosexuality without reporting such meeting to the administration. Never have classroom discussions on issues of homosexuality without the knowledge of the administration. Support the ideology that homosexuality was antithetical to Christian Science. Support the ideology that homosexuality could and should be healed.
And actually, the Principia's free speech policy was only put in place in 2009. And that's a good, framework for what I'm talking about. So the resistance is a time characterized by concentrated, organized advocacy and outreach. And the action taken by staff, faculty, and students during this time helped to dispel two misconceptions. The first being that the concerns of the LGBT plus community were invisible and shouldn't be talked about, and the second being that the majority of folks were against changing the policy. So the first thing that I want to talk about is a movement called I Support Equality at Prin, and it was started by Vincent Hare and Amy Baldoff, and they organized a group of 9 diverse students to advocate for changing the policy. So they began monthly meetings with the administration to advocate for this change. And one of the things that was told to them was, well, we're not actually hearing any complaints about the policy in place, so in comparison to when we cut the football team and we got hundreds of emails and phone calls, and so then this group was like, all right, and they made a petition, and the petition said the Principia should hold homosexuals and heterosexuals by the same standards and give them the same rights. And within 12 hours, they had something like 350 plus signatures, and within the first 2 weeks, they had over 1,000 signatures. And then, can you go back? Following this, they held sit-ins April 8th through the 12th of 2013, and basically, it was like 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. You would come and sit outside the administrative offices in the School of Government and just peacefully protest this policy. And people did their homework. They just had discussions, had really productive discussions, and then also just kept a really metaphysically uplifted mindset. And then they also asked alumni, faculty, staff, students to write letters to the trustees, and they ended up gathering 250 of these to present to the president at the time, who then turned them over also to the trustees, who they were able to set up a meeting with. And in fact, the sit-ins drew a lot of attention, and that actually got the trustees to come and visit Prin and want to speak with this group of students. In 2013, in the fall of 2013, after 28 years of teaching music at the college, Dr. John Neer decided he could no longer tolerate Principia's anti-gay stance, nor should he have to hide his identity. And as he retired, he was bestowed the Professor Emeritus title. And then shortly after, he wrote an open letter to Principia about its policy. He wrote, I could no longer tolerate what I know is wrong and sit idly by when many, including myself, have suffered and been deeply affected by hurtful discrimination and homophobia. It's a horrible thing to have to hide and lie who you are. Mrs. Eddy tells us, honesty is spiritual power. Times have changed since I joined the faculty in 1985, and the people's thinking has evolved, including that of the President of the United States, the Supreme Court of the United States, 16 individual states, and the District of Columbia, all of which have legalized same-sex marriage. And that most recently includes the state of Illinois, where Principia College resides. The anti-gay policy must be abolished. And he closes his letter with, until all are welcome at Principia as students and employees, I encourage everyone in disagreement with the current policy and discrimination in any form to stand up and be counted. That term, there was a batch of incoming freshmen who had seen a lot of the work that was being done and were very excited to engage and to hop on board. They that term they started a GSA, and then also planned a hand-holding week. And during that week, everyone would draw an equal sign on the back of their hand who was participating in it. And basically anyone you saw throughout that time, you would hold hands with them in between classes or walking around campus. And the idea was to just honor all types of relationships and kind of destigmatize same gender relationships. And the GSA applied for club membership routinely and were regularly denied status and told that it was not in the interest of Principia to grant them club membership, even though they appreciated them going through the proper channels to apply for club status. And so this meant that they couldn't receive funding like other clubs. They couldn't be open, they couldn't be hosting meetings or events related to the topic. They even had a really hard time just putting up posters that said GSA or anything like that. And GSA is Gay Straight Alliance, in case you don't know the acronym. And as they were even like putting up the hand-holding week flyers, one of the group participants told me that like they were leaving the hallway and then an RC at the time like took it down like right after they were there. And then and part of them petitioning for club status, they tried to rebrand it to be Spectrum to kind of lose the GSA association if that was the reason that they were getting flack. And they were kind of just told, no, that doesn't really it's still the same, so we still don't want to give you club status. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention is that late in the fall term of 2013, Annabelle Marquez reached out to the then Faculty Senate President at the time, Dr. John Williams, about her desire to support LGBT plus students and employees by a change in the admissions and hiring policy. And she said, this was a crucial and principled, necessary step to embracing everyone with love. And this was, and despite the fact that the perception, like I mentioned at the beginning, was that most folks were against it. So this sort of like was able to flip the script and show that the majority of the people were actually really open and supportive of change.
Okay, so now we have built our way all the way to November 18th, 2014, which was the actual day that the Board of Trustees issued a announcement that officially ended the discriminatory policy. That was, yes, November 18th, 2014. So we just celebrated its 5-year anniversary. So exciting. Yay! And we've printed out the entire announcement and the following Q&A and another Q&A in Leonard Hall if you would like to go and read that afterwards. So just want to highlight things from it. The wording of the policy change, it was a little like weird sometimes with how they chose to phrase certain things, but because the actual announcement isn't that long. So the main things that kind of indicate that the policy has changed is it says, in light of Principia's primary purpose to serve the cause of Christian Science, the board recognizes that sexual orientation does not prevent an individual from healing or making contributions to the growth of Christian Science around the world. And then it also says that we are directing the administration to establish consistent rules and regulations for students, faculty, and staff regardless of sexual orientation. And that regardless part is obviously what did it. So that was a huge moment, obviously, in our history. It was followed by a Q&A, which had like prepared questions that the trustees had already answered. And basically the main thing about the Q&A was that it was really insistent that like Principia's standards are still about supporting chastity and moral purity in relationships, because I think that they were nervous that a lot of the pushback would be that they're somehow abandoning that part of their mission. So they were really insistent on using those terms a lot. They also were very insistent that they would continue denying recognition of groups or clubs focused on the promotion or advocacy of sexuality or sensuality. And that was explicitly stated in the Q&A, which explains why Connect had a hard time becoming a club, which we'll get into a little later. And then there was also an additional Q&A posted a couple months afterwards, basically saying the same thing, that chastity and moral purity has not changed, and that this isn't like the board trying to promote homosexuality, because I think they were worried that they'd look like that by changing the policy. There was also a pilot article that was published in the end of that year, at the end of 2014, and it captured a lot of student responses. It's on the pilot website, actually, if you'd like to read it, and it captured some professor responses as well as John Neer's response. It also had some notable comments, which I think they're kind of funny, so I'm going to read them. Or not funny. One of them's kind of funny, but that captures a lot of different responses. But the first one says, "Confession, I can now be myself. I can now be who I am on the inside and stop hating myself for who I love. This is one of the greatest days of my life." But then there was also one that said, "Attention, Ferguson House will be exercising its option to continue its practice of discrimination based on sexual orientation in regards to admission to the house." So you get kind of a range of student response there, but the majority was positive, which is important, and that's what matters. So, yeah.
All right. So just because the policy did change did not mean, and even though it was super significant, it didn't mean it was the end of the struggle for LGBT inclusivity and equality at the Principia. The administration acted throughout this process kind of as if laying down the policy on the table was all they needed to do, and they didn't need to integrate it into the Principia community, which turned out to definitely not be the case. Following the change, Alice Jervin, the college registrar at the time, thought it would be appropriate to update the catalog to include a statement that explicitly doesn't discriminate by sexual orientation. And when she did, they responded in an interesting way that Samantha's going to get into.
She said, "I was told by the administration at the time that the policy had not really changed, so the catalog should not be changed. I did not understand how they could say that this was not a policy change when clearly it was."
I love that quote. I don't know why. This was hang on, actually. We're going to talk about Choose Love. So this is like some cute things that happened. A lot of people left the Principia, which is great. So this is the, sorry. Sorry, that was not appropriate. So there's the Choose Love movement that was started as actually someone who's present here tonight, Austin Moyle, put this quote on Facebook. Do you want to share it with us, actually? Actually, hang on, I'm going to introduce it. The Choose Love movement was kind of Principia's response to a lot of the administration not taking an active role in this. And so they said, we're going to support you if no one else. Go ahead.
So Austin wrote on Facebook, and he was a student senator at the time. Because very little community and cultural steps have been taken after the homosexuality policy change, Student Senate wanted to share the following message. Senate unconditionally loves all individuals, regardless of sexual orientation, race, gender, ethnicity, and political affiliation.
And they wore these little wristbands all the time to show their support, and it's very cute. So, meanwhile, there was some drama at the upper school. So, I don't know why people are laughing at things I'm saying. Okay. At the upper school, in case you're unfamiliar, the way that they choose the chapel speaker is they have a chapel speaker come in, and the board actually approves or denies what they pitch to them if they think it's appropriate or not. And so one One day, very shortly after the policy change, a speaker came in to talk to the chapel board, pitched a speech. The chapel board said it was great. Then, the following Monday, where they present it, completely subverted their speech, completely went into a rant about how homosexuality and Christian Science can never mix, and that the Principia was severing itself from the community by doing this. It wasn't ideal, certainly. However, I don't consider this to be any fault or any problem of the administrative side. They couldn't ultimately have done anything. Where I think they failed is they didn't address this issue thereafter. The students went to their classes, they went about their day, they weren't addressed it, they didn't have an assembly or anything to unpack this new information. They simply were kind of, like I said before, they set it down and walked away. It's the next thing. Yes, upper school uproar, I thought that was funny. All right. Okay, so this kind of ideology is also kind of reflected at the college with Connect's beginnings. So Jamie Fisher was a student at the upper school during the policy change and was amazed to find just how many of his friends were supportive when he came out, because he had felt so alone before, because he felt like he had to be closeted or he would get kicked out. He knew that because of this, he knew that people needed a safe space where they could find similar individuals who can support them and understand them. Members of the previous spectrum that had now kind of been on the fritz or hadn't been active mentored Jamie and encouraged him to make a more serious public organization for the LGBT plus community at Principia. Jamie noticed that part of the policy change Q&A said there still couldn't be a club based on sexuality and sensuality. This meant that part of the policy itself needed to change, and after much discussion, a compromise was made. A club could exist, but without the label of LGBT-specific inclusivity in its mission. In other words, it would just be another club about inclusivity and equality on campus. This was puzzling to Jamie and the other supporters of the new group, because they saw BSU, Friendship Around the World, and Half the Sky targeting a specific demographic in their support with no flack or being disabled from that without complication. The group decided that the LGBT-specific club was indeed worth the fight, and they continued to fight back, continued more one-on-one and group discussions. And as Jamie phrased it when I was talking to him about this, they took a little bit of a rest from it, and one day Dr. Palmer just signed it off, and Connect was given full club status, which is pretty awesome, because then we can do fun stuff like this.
Okay, if you could say that I support equality at Prin, the movement sort of birthed the GSA that became Spectrum, then I think you can also say that Spectrum mentored Connect into existence, and so they've built off of each other over time. So now we're looking at Connect Club is official, but then this ends up being the administration relies heavily on Connect and supporters to kind of bear the brunt of education and just implementing the policy and trying to shift the culture to be more understanding. Okay, so Carson Landry, the Connect Club president at the time, pursued writing a letter to the trustees to kind of point out some of the problematic language in the Q&A and the statement, and to kind of ask them to reconsider not wanting to give club status to clubs focusing on sexual orientation. And he wrote, we take issue with the practice of denying recognition of groups or clubs which focus on sexual orientation. It misrepresents issues of gender identity and sexual orientation. And so, this rule prevents a full embrace of the LGBTQ+ community following the 2014 policy change. We hope that you will carefully consider both the effects of this practice as well as the practical steps that can be taken to rectify the situation from an institutional perspective. Okay, so Connect this month is 2 years old, and oh boy, we have actually accomplished a lot. But that's totally thanks to all of the major steps that have been taken leading up to our existence, and then also all of the amazing support from faculty, staff, students who have totally engaged with this and wanted to spread awareness as well. Yes. Okay, so in spring 2018, Connect has a booth at the Whole World Festival in which they can fly pride flags on the chapel green, probably the first time that, like, on college campus that they've been in the open. And we had a lot of positive engagement from that, which was really encouraging. And then fall 18, Alice Durbin as the registrar, and also Dr. Westerhoff. We really want to thank them, as well as our faculty advisor, Dr. Barry Huff, and others for really pushing for the wording to change in the college catalog to match the 2014 change in the policy. And so this finally changes in fall 2018. And then President Dr. Westerhoff gave a public apology to the LGBTQ plus community on behalf of the administration at convocation, and then also at the president's address prior to the start of the semester. And then also we want to express gratitude to faculty member Dinah Ryan for really for reaching out to the interim dean of students at the time and really encouraging them to fight for gender inclusive housing. And later in the term, the interim dean of students called for a formation of a committee on gender inclusive housing. Yes, and then I don't know why that's so blurry, but that's fine. So I just want to point out that last semester we kind of were turning our focus to education, and so we made sure that all of our club meetings were kind of going through the LGBTQ plus alphabet, and then we also hosted 3 different workshops and an EMC, and yes, and then I'm turning it over to.
So our last era that we will be talking about is the imagined future. And to me, I think this last era is perhaps the most important because we are talking about our future. Where do we want print to be 2 and 5, 10 years from now? This era is perhaps the most important, but also I think it's the most hopeful because a lot is going on. So what does Connect see for our future? 1, an LGBT plus section on our website. We don't have that yet, but fortunately it's in the works. Student Life is looking at examples from other colleges, and we know that on this website we want a place for resources such as housing, language, and student groups. This website would provide education, but also it would link people to our club Connect and other resources. And we're hoping that by next semester, we could have a basic setup of this website up for people to use. Our second goal is gender identity being included in that diversity statement. As an institution, it's important that we recognize the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation. The GLAD website defines this well. So I'm just going to read it because I think it's important. We use the acronym LGBT to describe the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. The first 3 letters, LGB, refer to sexual orientation. The T refers to issues of gender identity. Gender identity is your own internal personal sense of being a man or a woman, or as someone outside of that gender binary. Sexual orientation describes a person's enduring physical, romantic, and/or emotional attraction to another person. For example, straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual. Transgender people may be straight, lesbian, gay, or bisexual. For example, a person who transitions from male to female and is attracted solely to men would be typically identified, would be typically, is that wrong or is that just me? Okay. As a straight woman. Gender identity also opens the door to those who identify outside of the gender binary of masculine and feminine, which most people assume when they hear the term gender. If we want to ensure that as an institution we are including the whole spectrum of gender identity and sexual orientation, we must reflect this intention in our wording and all of our policies across all our platforms. Our next goal is recognition that the policy change doesn't acknowledge or provide protections for identities other than homosexual. And this kind of goes along the same lines, like we want to be careful with our wording. The problem with this wording is that it excludes all the other sexual orientations and gender identities that make up the LGBT plus spectrum. And this term is considered by many as outdated and even offensive because it's been used as a derogatory term for so long. Our next goal would be gender inclusive housing. I really like how this university outlines their gender inclusive housing and why it's important to their sense of community. So I will read it. The Department of Housing and Residential Life at the University of Miami seeks to provide a living environment welcoming to all gender identities, one not limited by the traditional understanding of gender as only male and female. Gender inclusive housing allows for individuals to live together regardless of biological sex. This policy has been developed to better provide a supportive environment where all residents can feel safe in their housing assignments with respect to their gender identity and gender expression. Offering gender inclusive housing is supportive of creating a more inclusive campus climate and community. Gender inclusive housing is an environment where students' housing is not restricted to traditional limitations of the gender binary. And they go on, but currently at Prin, we are also thinking of having gender inclusive housing. And this past year, there was a committee, like I think Samantha mentioned, on gender inclusive housing, and they produced a report which then went to the president at the time, and they've decided there's going to be a pilot run on one floor of Sylvester. And this next semester, the dean of students is going to put the word out and see who would be interested. Over the summer, the necessary changes to the building, like in the restrooms and other aspects, will be made, and hopefully by the fall, we could start housing people in our pilot run of gender inclusive housing, which is really exciting. There is some concerns. For example, like, is one floor going to be enough for enough room for enough the demand that we might receive? Also, how do we identify applicants who need this space, and we want to make sure those who really need it and need it to feel safe and it's for their own well-being to get priority. How do we identify those applicants? And also, since it's a pilot run, how do we know if it's a success, and what do we do next? Do we then transition from a floor of gender inclusive housing to a whole house? And then which houses would we choose? So there's a lot that that goes with this, but we know it's necessary, and it's a step that Principio has to take and will take. Our next goal is gender inclusive restroom signs, and this is actually almost already completed. We currently only have signs in Claire McNabb, but there is signs being made for all other buildings, so that should be in all buildings soon. And our last goal, but there's always more goals, is making reparations to the LGBT alumni that either attended or worked at Prin. And I'm sure our current Dean of Students can talk more about this, but I know that our Dean of Students is interested in this and is open to a conversation, and that they want people to reach out to her and if they have any concerns or questions or have any ideas. But this is definitely something that Prin needs to take, and it's a goal that we want to achieve. So those are our goals, but if you go into Leonard, there's space for you to put up your own goals of where you want Prin to be years from now, and we're so excited that you're here and you're helping us make a better future for everyone. So.
And now that we've gotten through 50 years, we can finally get to our panelists, so go ahead and transition up. Our moderator tonight is going to be President Dana Katie. And as we transition, I kind of just wanted to talk about some of the inspiration for this event. So last spring, I was just a measly freshman, and I was on my way back from a trip, a long bus ride with my favorite professor. And she brought up some of the stories that she's heard in the LGBT community, some stories that impacted her over 2 decades. And I was like, for people like me, how can we teach people like me some of the history? And that's when we started to assemble this panel, and we got really lucky with this panel who we got. It spans 5 decades, amazing stories throughout, and we can't wait to share it for you. So go into Dana Katie.
All right, so we are going to turn to our panel section now, which we're so excited to share with you. Hello, distinguished panelists. We're so happy you can be here. We would like to start with introductions, and we want to give each of you the opportunity to introduce yourselves, and specifically how you are situated in Principia's history. What about your time at Prin, whether it was at the college, whether it was at the upper school, anything about the institution, how that impacted you and where you fit in that, and anything you'd like to share, and we'll just go down the list and keep it semi-short so that we can continue to ask you other questions, but please introduce yourselves to the campus.
Hi, I'm Jillian. I went to the upper school from 76 to 80. I had gotten involved with a girl, and I was put on probation. There was quite an interesting interrogation process that was pretty unsettling. Then I was also at the college. I was going to graduate in '84, but 6 months before graduating, I was actually in Sylvester House, and somebody had seen me with another woman who I was involved with, and got reported to the Dean of Students, and was asked to leave. So that's kind of my association with Principia. I also stopped practicing Christian Science because you couldn't be gay and practice Christian Science. I'm now a practicing Buddhist. Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm coming from on this.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
My name's Tom Scherholtz. I'm a graduate of the upper school and the college. I think maybe the best way to situate my history is to just briefly say how it is I'm here today. 15 months ago, it would have been unthinkable for me to even set foot on the Principia campus because it had been made very plain to me that as an openly gay man, I was not welcome here. In the early 90s, some GLBT alumni organized informally a piece of history that wasn't captured here, which I'm happy to share and add to the archive, an alum, David White, loosely organized GLBT alumni into what he called the Principia GLBT Alumni Association, and he at that time had a good deal of contact with the campus and put out a newsletter probably 3 or 4 times a year, which he photocopied and mailed. This is before the internet. In 1994, I was living in New York City at the time, and that was the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion, which, for those of you who may not know, figures very prominently in GLBT history in the United States and internationally. And it was a time when GLBT people came from around the country and perhaps from around the world to observe that anniversary. And with so many people coming to New York, we got many of the people who were on the mailing list and identified as GLBT alumni of Principia to gather in my apartment. There were 6 of us. And it was fascinating and wonderful. We were not unlike this group, divided very much by age. Different generations were represented, and it was a very nice meeting. Sometime after that, I couldn't tell you exactly how long, though, David received a communication from Principia's legal counsel informing him that if he continued to use the Principia name or the Principia seal, that he would face legal action. It was at that point that I said, I'm done, and for my own well-being felt that I needed to disassociate myself from Principia. And I say that with a very heavy heart, not for me, well, for me and for Principia. I think that the division that has existed over the years is a disservice not only to the individuals who identify with the GLBT community, but also to the institution, because we've turned our back on the marvelous diversity that has come into this institution. And so if I have sadness, it's as much for that as it is for my own experience. I better leave it there for now.
Thank you. I arrived on the Principia campus as a faculty member in 1989, sort of concurrent. John Neer was teaching here at that time. I knew I had an identity, and I phrased it to myself and to those close to me as that I formed my most intimate relationships with women. And I came to the campus, I'd been here as an international student, and I was caught in that vortex of the 1990s in the US, where I suddenly realized that the word homosexual and homosexuality was all over the media. There were Senate hearings on what causes homosexuality in the military, should it be allowed. You'd turn on NPR and there would be a talk show, what caused homosexuality? And all of a sudden, I was aware of the history of discriminatory behavior against students at Principia. But as a faculty member, I'd felt sort of okay for a year or so, and then all of a sudden I realized that I was a potential target. And so I lived my decade of the 90s in what I call a version of the French Resistance. I didn't speak out. I spoke to my straight allies, and it was the work of extraordinary straight allies on the campus who would interact with the students, who would be the front line of all the discussions. And my role was a lot in the background, talking to a very close group of mainly women faculty. There was a huge conflation, I will say, at that time of homosexual, lesbian, and feminist and woman, which all kind of got grouped and slodged together into a very threatening thing to the administration. So I did all sorts of things. I wrote pieces, and they would feed out anonymously and those kinds of things. It was wrenching. I left, I resigned in February 1999. I handed in my letter of resignation after a staff member had been called in and asked a question and told the truth and been fired on the spot. And I knew that if they'd have called me in and asked the question, I can use words in a way that probably I would have found a way to tell the truth and not get fired. And I knew I'd had enough. It was wrong. And thus I ejected myself from Principia. My experience in the local branch church was altogether much more wrenching and problematic for me. That went on for another year, and I left the branch church at that point.
Hi, I'm Kristen Martin, and I guess it's nice and fitting that we can follow each other. I would characterize myself as an ally of this group, this LGBT group, and I think for me, I'm grateful that you guys are doing this work. I'm grateful that the rest of the distinguished panelists did what they did, didn't give up, and came back. And I know for some of you, this might be the first time you've come back. So I just really like to honor that. For me, I came to Principia in my 7th grade year. I graduated from the upper school in 1994 and from the college in 1998. And during that time, I would say there was a growing, slow, it took a long time for me to understand the pain that this issue, this discrimination was causing my friends. And I was close friends with people that I didn't know were in the closet. One of them died without telling me. And when I learned that, I'm sorry, I don't want to get emotional. I started to wonder what was my complicity in that silence. And so when I had the opportunity to come back through a series of events, I ended up adjuncting at Principia College from 2010 to 2014. And that was a really special time to be on this campus because it gave me the opportunity to watch the students not give up. We saw in the 90s when I was a student here, I probably overlapped with Anne a little bit, as faculty, we saw waves of demonstration followed by graduation, followed by waves of more demonstration a few years later. And from 2010 to 2014, what I saw was a gradual building of determination and just not giving up. And so I saw this enthusiasm from the students. What I also saw was an opportunity as an adjunct to sort of be close to the students because I didn't have a lot of academic standing, and I was closer to them in age, and also be close to the faculty because adjuncts were allowed to, at that time, I don't know if this is still true, attend faculty senate meetings. And so I felt like a little bit of a slightly invisible bridge between those things. And I was able to attend the sit-ins that the students organized. And eventually, after much wrestling with myself and not getting a solid answer from faculty that I would consult on campus about whether I would get fired for signing the petition, once I was walking my dog in the night at home in St. Louis, and I had sort of an invisible conversation with this friend that had passed, and I knew I couldn't look him in the face if I didn't sign the petition. So the next day I went to the sit-in and did, and while I was sitting there, a student sat down next to me and said, "You know what really sucks, Kristen?" And I said, "What?" And the student knew I was faculty and said, "I have to pretend to be a straight ally to have a voice on this issue." And as an educator, I knew there was something we could be doing better in terms of our pedagogy. If a 19-year-old had figured out that they had to lie to have a voice, that was on us to do better education and to do better moral leadership. And so I did I was in grad school at art school at that time, and that thought about voice and silence showed up in my work, and I actually brought the artwork that I made during that time. It's out in the lobby. Then in a couple years after a year and a half after I stopped adjuncting here, I was offered a position to teach full-time at the upper school, at Print Upper School. So I did that for 3 years, where I got to work with my esteemed colleague, Ross Furbush, as far as I know, the first out faculty on the upper school campus. And we co-led an affinity group for LGBT plus upper school students, and that was a real treat.
Thank you. So I was at the upper school for 4 years. I remember my freshman year, there was a mass kicking out, I guess, if that's a word, of students because they were gay. And I didn't know I was gay. You would think that like my crush on Brad Pitt would have been a sign, but I missed that. Until senior year, where I'm sitting choosing my college, and I'm about to fall asleep on 2nd South in the dorm, looking at the ceiling, and I realized my big decision between Principia and a different school was easy, and that's because I thought I was maybe gay. And so I chose to go to University of Washington, where I still tried to date a girl somehow. And then I really did realize this wasn't a Principia thing, a Christian Science thing, that I was gay. And one thing that helped me realize that is because I saw a mirror. I saw mirrors outside in the real world that reflected who I was. And I realized that at the upper school, I didn't have those mirrors. It wasn't talked about in the community. I didn't have a role model that was a Christian Scientist and gay that I could see myself in and start discovering my own identity. Right? All we had was characters on TV and that sort of thing. So once I met another gay person, I realized what being gay actually was about, and that was my romantic interest, the person that I wanted to love, not this character that was being built on TV or what was being told in the Christian Science narrative. So after making that discovery, I told my closest people, and that's my family. That turns out to have been a momentous moment for one of my sisters, Lauren, who was at the college during this time. So Lauren really dove into the equality fight. Her picture was up there previously. She was doing sit-ins. She was on the Spectrum board, I guess, and really, really involved. Meanwhile, I'm in UW and living and I was still closeted. And the reason I was closeted to my Seattle friends was not because of the way they would react. And in fact, when I told them, they'd be like, so, you know, and then continue to do chemistry work, right? The reason I didn't tell them is because I didn't want my friends at Principia to find out. So it's crazy how far I was, thousands of miles in my own world, and I was still being closeted because I didn't want my Principia friends to find out. I came out officially junior year of college, and then I had the idea, I want to play soccer in college. And so I reached out to my college friends at Principia, and I came for 1 semester. It was my domestic abroad, I called it, and I came to Principia, and I played soccer, and it was fall of 2014, which, as you know, is 5 years from now, or in the past, right? It was a great experience. I loved playing soccer. I did a biology project on campus that got published in a national biology magazine, but I also had an opportunity to come out to some of my friends in person, and that was really important to me. Some of them because I wanted to come out to them in person because I knew they would be super supportive, right? And others, I just knew that they would want to hear it from me, even though there were a lot of awkward conversations and not necessarily, they didn't really know how to react, that sort of thing. So I finished graduating at UW after my domestic abroad, and then I applied to be a teacher at the upper school. I didn't get the job the first time around. I think the policy change was a little bit fresh. The second time around, I did get the job, and I knew that I was going into a space that was still fresh with controversy, and I what was most important to me, and it's kind of like Anne, were the allies. The straight allies that I knew I had embedded at the Principia Upper School, where I could make that decision and I would be protected emotionally, right? My job would be protected, and then I can do some good work. So I was at the upper school for 2 years, and I really enjoyed that time. And I should say I did co-lead, like Kristen said, with the Spectrum group, and they are watching live right now, so wave. Yeah, they're in the Idea Center with snacks, and so I'm really grateful for the support that we continue to get from allies at the upper school who are making sure that there are visible mirrors for those students at the upper school.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing. We're so glad you all are here and you can bring your diverse perspectives. Some of you already talked about this a little in sharing your backgrounds, but whoever wants to speak can. Not all of you have to again, but I'm really interested, I think a lot of us are, in hearing about how Prin's actions affected your relationships with Christian Science, because there's obviously, we've already spoken on how that negative intersectionality between the two can be very damaging and turns a lot of people away from Christian Science. But we'd love to hear your perspectives on how you individually dealt with that and how your relationship with the religion was affected. So whoever would like to speak on that.
I'll go on that one. It's a really big question. It's a really big question. So anybody who wants to stay after, I'll elaborate. I'll try to keep it brief. The short answer is, while I was a student at Principia, it had zero effect on my relationship with Christian Science because I didn't even have the space in which to explore for myself who I was or what I was in terms of any of the aspects of identity that we've been talking about tonight. There simply weren't the words. We didn't have the language. We didn't know how to talk to one another. We didn't know how to talk to ourselves. And I kind of sort of knew that I was different, and I kind of sort of knew that I was attracted to men, and I kind of sort of knew that that was a problem. No, I really knew that that was a problem at Principia that time, and that if I were to say anything, that I'd be out and would likely face the loss of all of my friends, the loss of all of my family, and essentially it was impossible for me to imagine a life in which I was an out gay man. I mean, it speaks to the time as well. I mean, this was not just at Principia. This was the larger world, as the older folks in the audience can attest to. But that world was no different at Principia, and Principia had done nothing to step out beyond it. I should say that when I was at Principia, I was a devout Christian Scientist. I was a transfer student. I actually went through class instruction after my freshman year in college at the University of California. So I arrived at Principia deeply committed to the faith. I served in the Christian Science organization. I was a first reader while I was here. And my first job out of Principia was as a copy kid in the newsroom at the Christian Science Monitor, where in my first week on the job, I misread the signals of a coworker and expressed some interest, and he promptly reported me to the management of the Monitor, and I was escorted to the office of one of the senior editors at the Monitor and told that I had to heal my condition or there was no place for me. And effectively, I was put on probation my first week on the job. I'm happy to say that I managed to continue to work at the Monitor for 3.5 years, but it was always in fear that the next telephone call was the one that was going to tell me that I was fired and that I would somehow have to explain this to my family and friends who I knew would be uncomprehending. And so it was no small thing when given an opportunity to leave the monitor for other reasons, I took it because I knew that I needed the time and the space to figure out who I was and what I needed to be in the larger world. Let me comment briefly, too, about what I probably should have said at the outset in my first remarks, and that was after the experience of essentially saying, you know, Principia really doesn't want me, okay, I'll deal with that and move on. Fast forward 25 years, and I, which would have been about a year ago, and I got a little more than a year ago, and I got an email from my cousin, also an alumna of Principia, and she said, you need to listen to the remarks of the new president. And she kind of gave me a preview of what to expect, but I went to the website and listened to the convocation remarks, and I will say, hearing an apology from Dr. Westerhoff, I wept. I could not have imagined hearing such a thing ever. And that brought into high relief the personal loss that I had felt at being so estranged from a place that I love so much. And in the wake of hearing her remarks, I wrote her a letter. And I said, I can't speak on behalf of all LGBT alumni of Principia, but I accept the apology. And you have to know that, at least for me, I think of this as a beginning, not the end. After decades of being called sinful and evil, simply removing the label doesn't change everything. And you'll have to be patient with me if it takes some time to get used to this, what appears to be a significant change of attitude and change of heart on the part of Principia. So that letter led to some conversations and led to Dr. Westerhoff inviting me to serve on an external review panel, which evaluated student experience at the college over the last year. And I'm very grateful for that opportunity to be entrusted with coming to the college and talking with students and faculty and administration to evaluate student experience. And as I say, as of 16 months ago, that would have been absolutely unimaginable.
I will say what's really interesting to me is the juxtaposition in my life of two such contrasting things. The 90s as a faculty member, largely a time of great part of it around Christian Science, fearing being fired pretty much every day. I had a joke with a colleague that we were always waiting for the phone call. Every time, to some degree, every time the phone rang, you wondered if it would be the phone call that would get you. But I think what saved me, I didn't come. I hadn't been to Principia. That wasn't how I got into Christian Science. And I'd been through class instruction in the 80s before I began teaching as a faculty member. And I worked out who I was at that period, and I spoke to my teacher. And I said, this is what the story is. This is who I am. And he said probably what saved me. He said, don't cut yourself off from love, but don't think your church is ready for it or your community is ready to hear it. That was the mid-80s. I mistakenly thought by the kind of the 90s, maybe be ready, but I misjudged that one. But so I had this bedrock sense that I was okay in with the larger understandings of the universe. I just knew that this was a really fouled up place, and therefore it was very unsafe. And then eventually, some of you may know I am an educator. I'm a professional educator. I'm the dean of the College of Education at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. That's relevant because I was asked not to teach Sunday school because people were fearful of my interaction with children. That doesn't sit well, right? It was a double kind of thing that was just extraordinary and absurd and deeply, deeply painful. So I haven't been a member of a branch church for 20 years. I'm fortunate that, as we all know, Christian Science, in some ways, what I know and understand about the world is massively built on the spiritual insights and frameworks and languages of Christian Science, and you don't necessarily need a priest to access it. So.
Well, we can continue this discussion. I also wanted to briefly touch on a question regarding Prin's reconciliation efforts, which have not been very apparent. We had Dr. Westerhoff's apology, and we have moments like tonight where Dean Dietz hosted us, and the other deans as well, and members of the cabinet. But particularly going forward, especially as Prin is looking for its new president, what would you like to see be done for the reconciliation of the LGBT plus community who has been so hurt by Principia's policies? What specific things would you like to see happen, or speak to how you've felt in these reconciliation efforts a little more? Anything you'd like to share?
I'll speak to that a little bit. I kind of came through to this event because my brother spoke at an alumni event to the fact that our family was negatively impacted for decades because of my being kicked out, and reconciliation needs to happen, I think, on a one-to-one basis, and because there can't be what will, is good for one person, one size fits all. I don't think that works. It might be good to start setting aside funds of sorts to be able to accommodate for what people might be willing to share, saying, hey, this would help me feel a lot better. In my case, I was 6 months away from graduating, and I asked if I could get my degree, and they said yes. I also asked if I could walk at graduation this spring, and they said yes. So that helps a lot. That helps a lot. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
I'll jump in. It's a wonderful question. It's a big question. It's a question that I can't answer for everyone, as Jillian said. I think events like this are absolutely a first step in reconciliation, and I applaud the Connect board for all of the hard work that you all have done in bringing us here and bringing together all of this information, in creating an atmosphere where we can talk about this piece of Principia's history openly, and see collectively. I mean, I don't think I'm the only person in the room who thinks of Principia as a family, and sometimes families disagree about things, and sometimes there's a learning curve. It has to do with generations. It has to do with different points of view. That's natural. But reconciliation for me is really about healing, and healing is ongoing, and I think it really is incumbent, not necessarily for the LGBT alumni and students to to say this is what reconciliation is. It really is for every member of the family to look in their own heart and to say, what's my part in all of this? What have I lost on account of this history? What has this community lost? And what do we need to do to reclaim it and to rebuild it?
Thanks. I think that, you know, as I've stepped away from teaching, perhaps briefly, I feel like I've put myself on a sabbatical. I have a small child, and that's why, one of the reasons why I'm not teaching right now. But I think as, you know, if I think about what does an apology mean, you know, we teach our littlest ones that sorry means you're changing your behavior, right? And so if you say sorry, I think it's especially important to immediately, part of that reconciliation is doing our best right now with the students that are in front of us. And I'm using that us, even though I'm not teaching here right now, because I think you're right. I think a lot of us feel like Principia is a family, and when it's family, you care more. You know, it's not just a place where you work or you go to school. And sometimes that makes it hard to, those relationships become more intense. It's harder to make these changes, right? And feel like you're not hurting somebody. But I think for me, I think part of that reconciliation is to just continuing to encourage and support anybody who interacts with the students to just continue to mirror that or express that, a sense of moral courage, so that they see us being vulnerable. They see us willing to learn. They see us listening to how they refer to themselves, what makes them feel safe, and what we can learn from students who come to us presenting different than maybe we ever thought somebody could, you know. And I think we all know, as anybody who's an educator or who's been a student and have this feeling, you know what it feels like when somebody sees you. You do your best work, you show up happy, ready to learn, right? We all know that. And what if we could bring that to every student, not just the majority?
I'd add one more thing, and that is, I count myself very fortunate that I had someone who knew to reach out to me and tell me about Dr. Westerhoff's remarks. Absent that notification, I wouldn't be here today. I would still be kind of knowledgeable that there was a policy change, but not having had any outreach, not really caring very much because I'd moved on. And so I can see that it could possibly be very helpful for Principia to proactively reach out to LGBTQIA identified alumni, especially. You know, we celebrate so many reunions of classes here. I can see that Principia creating a space for the larger universe affected by all of this history to gather and share and get reconnected. Because I know, you know, my reconnection started last fall with the letter to Dr. Westerhoff. I had the privilege of serving on the panel on student experience and success, and so I was here quite a bit the last year and getting reacquainted and reconnected. And I think that should be available to every.
I would just support what you said, Tom, because a colleague, the individual who was fired in 1999 that led to my own resignation, didn't know about this event, and so she found out about it. I, notified her, and then at 4:14 today, she texted me, and she'd spoken to me on Sunday, and she was crying. She stopped the car and she was crying, just speaking about this event. And she texted me today at 4:14 and said, "Thank you so much for representing us this evening. Let the healing begin, I pray." And that's what I do want to acknowledge, the extraordinary event this is. It isn't everything, but it's extraordinary for me to be here, for this individual to know that I'm here, and to have everybody present. I feel very honored to be part of it.
I might add something. I think that this is an incredible event. I think that this is a great starting place to start reaching out to LGBT people that Principia has wronged and negatively impacted. I also want to back up a little bit and talk about that this is still an issue today. And I mean, Anne was talking about how they didn't want her to be a Sunday school teacher, to be with children. That happened to me at the upper school 2 years ago, right? So someone came to me with that, right? I also, before coming to the upper school, called a practitioner, and they said that gay people didn't belong at Principia. This isn't a generational thing too, right? I had a friend of mine from high school, and that who was talking behind my back about sexuality, and I confronted him, and I called him, and he said that there was no intersectionality between homosexuality and Christian Science, and that I didn't belong teaching at the upper school. That's someone that's my age, right? And so I just want to also be careful and kind of echo what Kristen is talking about, of investing into our current students, our current culture, our community right now. We need to reach back in the past and make those apologies, and we need to tell them that we're sorry and show them the progress that we're making, but that doesn't mean we stop investing now. If there was a gay teacher going to the upper school, I would tell them how much support they had, but then I'd also still give a warning, right? That this community is still going through a big change right now. And the change was 5 years ago, but it takes a while for culture to follow. So,
can I just say something? Because I feel like we have to recognize these things are just factually appalling. The kinds of things we're allowing each other to believe about gender identity and about sexuality, how it manifests in the world, this is ignorance of the greatest type that we shouldn't be satisfied with. We can't allow each other to exist with these ridiculous myths that somehow pedophilia is in any way connected. What are we doing? We have to not have as much gentle, kind, creeping patience with something that is just plain wrong. And we have to stop those things. And I concur completely with what you're saying. I appreciate you sharing those stories, because they're very relevant.
I would add, Anne, that when I finally familiarized myself with the policy change language, that I saw in there still, as helpful a statement as that was, and it was very helpful, and I'm very grateful for it. To my mind, there still was some very old and antiquated ideas, and especially equating sexuality with sensuality. So homosexuality is no more sensual than heterosexuality, which is to say, both are and both aren't. And I don't know that that's commonly appreciated yet, or widely appreciated in this community. So I think that there's some work to do to educate ourselves about how the wider world understands everything we've been talking about, and how I was talking with a colleague this afternoon, and I said, you know, one of the challenges that I think that Principia has, and I would say that it was a challenge for me when I was here, is knowing what Christian Science can do and what it can't. Christian Science can't tell you how to get to Nigeria, and if you rely on Christian Science to tell you how to get to Nigeria, you probably won't get there. And I would be the first to say that I left Principia with what I would call a really doctrinaire spirituality. It was very formal. I thought, you know, I read my lesson, I call a practitioner when I need to, I do all of these things, and I'm doing it right. And I have to say what life has taught me is that that a spiritual path informs what I do, but I have to engage as a human being with my own human heart and the human hearts of the people around me to understand what the heck is going on, what I feel is right, and learn how to be as good a human being as I can, which is not divorced from my spiritual path, but it is separate. You know, we have in the wider world, and this has come up with some of my friends, there's the term spiritual bypass. Spiritual bypass I've come to understand as the practice of using spiritual precepts to avoid human problems. And somebody had said, so what does that mean? And I said, well, if you take the story of the Good Samaritan, it's as though the Good Samaritan finds the person beaten up in the road and says, divine love always has met and always will meet every human need. Gotta go. We have a responsibility as spiritual practitioners to attend to the human needs of ourselves and one another, and I count that among the most valuable lessons that I've had since I've left Principia, and I think it's incumbent on Principia to provide that lesson to all the students who are here.
I might build off of that, if that's okay. I couldn't help myself, and I got, because like many people, after you have to internally grapple with where Christian Science falls in your life. Like from the beginning, I knew that my relationship with God was tight. Like, we good, you know, like we understand each other, but is Christian Science that access, that line of communication that I need to communicate with God? And I started questioning that. So I remember I was in Panera and I was eating mac and cheese when I thought of this, and it helped me kind of conceptualize my sexuality in the Christian Science world. And my warning, my disclaimer on this is for you to think about and for you to share with your allies, right? But from bad experiences, I really highly suggest, especially if you are internally questioning your sexuality and you are kind of grappling with this conversation, that you don't engage in spiritual warfare with someone on the opposite side of this issue. Some of the most damaging conversations I've had were when I tried logically explaining how I thought I fit in this world with God and Christian Science with someone who was a wall and who would spit back Bible verses and maybe had better experience than me in the scriptures and so could word their ways around, and it was just exhausting, okay? So, but one thing I learned in Panera, back to that. Sure, you can hold that. So this is called like the circle and the dot. So like in here is God in blue, okay? And God represents like spirituality, okay? And for me, I don't know about you, but my goal as like a human being is to like get closer to God and become more spiritual, right? And leave matter behind, which I was taught in Sunday school. So now on here is kind of the mortal existence. This is my beautiful circle. So this is my circle of mortal existence, and where I was over here, and that's that I was gay, right? And then over here was a straight person. Okay, sorry, you see what I'm talking about. Okay, and so what some Christian scientists were telling me was, in order to get to God, my path had to be like this. Oh, I don't love men, I love women. And then I don't love women physically, but I'm a spiritual being. Right? And so, thank you. So, and that goes with gender identity, right? We could do the same thing. I'm a cis male, right? Let's say someone told me, in order to get closer to God, first you have to transition, and then you can get closer to God, right? It's a long path, right? I'm not going to walk all that way. I'm going to go straight to God. So now I have to draw the arrow. Straight to God. So that's helped me conceptualize it. And once again, use this for your own self and for positive conversations. But just be careful, because you can get in a lot of emotional trouble if you start arguing with someone who's not ready to have that conversation.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Let's give a big round of applause to our panelists.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories. We want to open up the space to allow for questions.
We don't have too much time.
We don't have too much time. But if there are burning questions, and Layla and Emma are going to take the mics and have them.
So just to stand up if you have a question, right? Yeah.
Nobody has questions. Awesome.
Covered everything.
Don't be shy.
Thank you for having this meeting. And I want to say I'm sorry on behalf of any old ideas that I had, because, we were raised with him, And I was thinking about, now I want to have someone who like left Principia because of this change. I just want to put my arms around them and say, I love you too. God doesn't know the difference, Can't you love no matter what? So I want to embrace them as well. But I had an interesting occasion this summer where I went to hear someone sing, and he was a transgender male. And then I'm sitting there enjoying the concert, but I'm trying to figure out, what does that mean? And just noticing my reaction to how I'm going to take in that experience. Was it a man being a woman? It didn't matter the message, but I was just, and I loved the experience, but I was just noticing my approach to it and how different it is, and thinking about the younger generation, my children, who are just open to everyone and everything, and it's just about love. I have a nephew who was gay, and I was probably, heal it at the time when I was a lot older than him. And of course you've changed, and you hope you've changed, and he can't embrace me, and it's like, are you gonna raise homophobic children? And pretty nasty, but you just want to love, and I apologize, and how can we then forgive ourselves or forgive that generation and go forward? So that's where I am. I didn't raise homophobic kids, do you know what I mean? So, but it's just understanding all that, and my children are after me all the time about gender and language, and, because it's a lot to take in when you've never thought about it before. So how do we forgive ourselves? And how do you forgive us?
I think that's really a rhetorical question, and it's a question that you know, I ask, and I think we're all asking. One of the things that I think your comments raise for me is it's why it's helpful for us to know some history. You know, I say 1974 or 5, I forget which, was an interesting year. That was the year that psychologists and medical science took out homosexuality as a mental illness. Why does that matter? It matters that if you were taught in graduate school, your parents were taught, your Christian Science Sunday school teacher was taught by somebody who was educated by somebody before that date, all of a sudden, in their head, maybe this old piece of information about homosexuality being a disease. The language that was used in the 90s was, and on this campus, homosexual. Many of us haven't used that for decades, but that really misled us all into obsessing about sensuality and sex and all the rest of it. I had the pleasure of being asked by the chief executive officer of the Principia if my relationships were intimate woman-to-woman companionship or gratuitous sex. I had no difficulty answering, so I was on the good side, because I clearly said it's woman-to-woman companionship. I mean, really? So I think as some of the forgiveness can sometimes come from saying, okay, yeah, this generation, this is what we were taught at that time. That's probably an old idea, and it's okay. So it doesn't quite answer, but I think it's why being open about the history sometimes helps us let go of things. I've changed my language enormously. The breaking into the world of a knowledge of gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, as very different places, very different things, has been enormously helpful to me personally. So I think that's why education helps, right? We're a college.
When I was, just to add on to that, when I was hired as an adjunct at the college, I did my HR interview over the phone, and the HR person that was asking me those same types of questions asked me if I knew what the homosexuality policy was, and I said I did. I've been a student there for like ever. I notably didn't say that I agreed with it. But then this person went on to justify the policy by saying, well, you know, because I have, and I'm paraphrasing slightly because I don't remember the exact words, I don't want to like sleep with and make out with all of my girlfriends. This person was obviously straight. And it reminds me that something that Brian Stevenson talks about the critical importance, especially for allies, of proximity. We cannot understand each other if we don't know each other. Jacques Cousteau said, people protect what they love. And so we have to get close to each other to know how each of us works. And so I think some of that forgiveness can happen, maybe some of that rebuilding, that demonstration of good effort can happen by just showing up, as an ally, by being present, by asking, by being willing to be wrong. Mm-hmm. As teachers, we think we're running the show, and I hope I communicated to my students when I was teaching at Prin in one campus or the other that I had an earnest desire to make them feel safe and heard and seen, and if I wasn't doing that right, they should come tell me. Like, I want to know if I'm not doing it right. And so I think that's part of that thing. When you get close to somebody who's different from you, we can understand each other better.
I would also add that, and I think you raise a very good point, that there may be the reluctance of people whose hearts are open, but whose words aren't quite up to speed, mm-hmm. to use them. Yeah. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to have patience with one another, and to communicate as well as we can until we can do better. And so that will inevitably, I mean, as all learning does, involve some missteps and mistakes. Yeah. And we need to learn how to be, on the one hand, brave enough to move forward, despite the fact that we might make mistakes, and also be compassionate enough to, when we're the person hearing a mistake, to find the best way to support connection and understanding and learning and keeping the family together.
Hi, my name's Byron DeLear, and I am brother to Jillian DeLear here. First of all, I want to express my appreciation for all of you to show the courage to open yourselves up to having an opportunity at furthering a conversation and being here and sharing your experiences, your intimate experiences of pain and suffering due to this cultural injustice that's moving in a positive direction now. I do want to add a little bit to the experience that my family had. When Jillian was at the college, I was attending the upper school, and both of my parents were teachers at the upper school. My mother, Wilma DeLear, taught piano, and my father taught investments and voice. And in fact, my mother and father were the organist and soloist at the Town and Country Church for about 20 years there at Principia. And when the situation came up with Jillian, I can remember, I think my father told me, about what was going on with Jillian, that she was being kicked out of the college. And I just have to emphasize the amount of ripples of damage that created within our family, because we were so involved in the Principian community. And to have that kind of sense of rejection was, it's hard to put into words the impact psychologically, the psychological damage that can have on a family and in our relationship to Christian Science and to Principia. Being a woman in the world is tough enough in terms of getting representation and opportunities for positions of leadership and issues of gender equity. And then also being a member of the LGBT community is even tougher. And then to have that formal institution that you're a member of sort of line up with the same level of rejection and diminishing your ability to be honest and real in the world. Something that Anne said resonated when she said that what was your name again? Kristen, sorry. Something that you mentioned about seeing students clearly and honestly, and having students' identities being clearly and honestly metabolized by the institution itself is going to create a flourishing and a blossoming of the relationship between the educational institution and the ability to raise whole men and women in society. I think probably the most proudest thing that Principia can lay claim to is creating whole men and whole women that operate in society with moral fortitude. So again, a sense of great appreciation for the Dean of Students, Maya Dietz. I was given a call by Dave Lovegren, who was calling certain alumni members and asking about their experience at Principia. And the reason why I didn't talk about my experience at Principia, but rather focused on my sister's experience at Principia, because it was an opportunity to voice the experience that we had gone through, and in an attempt to pursue some sense of loving correction. And I guess the big takeaway for me is being able to be present in the moment and get out of yourself, you have a greater opportunity to heal those around you. And in this sense, I think it's been a healing experience for Jillian to be here. And so thanks for listening to a few stories and situation that we had gone through as a family. Thank you.
Jillian, I have 2 questions for you. Number 1, how many
Yes.
people are you how many people are you allowed to invite to your graduation this year?
How many do I need to?
Well, that was
Yeah.
the second question.
Right.
I would like to come as your guest.
I would like that very much. Thank
Yeah,
you.
and I graduated, I think, around 20 years after you, but I had a very similar situation. I didn't get kicked out, but thank you for being a trailblazer. Maybe that's why I didn't get kicked out. And you're 20 years after me, I think, somewhere around there. But yeah, it is a continuous fight. And what do we have to do to change? We have to come out, we have to talk about it, and we have to share our stories. You guys were amazing. And if you think someone might be LGBTQ, say, hey, how's your partner? Open up that conversation because it feels good. We like that. We want that. Come to us. Talk to us about our families. If you think we're hiding, we are. We're hiding. Still today, I'm hiding. So engage. And tell us we're okay. Because guess what? A lot of people are telling us we're not. So be that change.
I'd like to thank you all, Connect in particular. You've got a job. I'm expecting a memo or 2 from you within the next couple of days. There are a number of things that you've said that can be accomplished quickly. Boss, I think there are a couple of things that can be done quickly. A lot of other things will take time, and I can only apologize that they're going to take time. And thank you. Yeah. 2 more. Tom, you want to help shake up summer? Because if the tennis players can have affinity groups, why can't LGBTQ have an affinity group during Alumni Week? And Jillian, you know that I've been asked to serve as interim president. My goal is to have that the shortest term possible. You've just given me a reason to serve through graduation.
Thank you.
It would be my honor to stand on stage when you cross it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Just wanted to quickly say a huge thank you to the panelists for your vulnerability, your heartfelt sharing, your courage, your grace to be here tonight. A thank you to the Connect board who has poured their hearts and souls into preparing tonight's event, and to everybody in this audience and live streaming who has helped us get to this point today. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're gonna invite everyone to go to Leonard Hall, where we have rainbow cookies, and we have a visual representation of our timeline, which we walked you through earlier, and then we have Kristen's art also. So welcome to Leonard Hall. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you everyone who helped contribute to this process.
Touch me softly,